On September 12, 1980, after a decade of escalating political violence, economic paralysis, and institutional deadlock that had rendered civilian governance increasingly ineffective, the Turkish armed forces executed a coordinated nationwide coup d'état that dissolved parliament, suspended the constitution, and transferred authority to a military council under the leadership of General Kenan Evren, marking the third direct military intervention in the Republic of Turkey since the Second World War, and situating the country once again at the intersection of domestic instability and Cold War strategic imperatives, as Turkey's position on the southeastern flank of NATO endowed internal developments with significance far beyond its borders. The coup was preceded by years of fragmentation, following the 1971 military memorandum, during which successive coalition governments proved unable to control spiraling inflation, labor unrest, and a cycle of political assassinations and street violence driven by militant factions of the far left and far right, with daily death tolls that by the late 1970s reached levels that alarmed both Turkish elites and foreign observers. As universities became battlegrounds, trade unions were paralyzed, and state authority eroded in the face of armed groups claiming ideological legitimacy amid the broader polarization of Cold War politics. By 1979, the Turkish economy was in severe distress, burdened by foreign debt, shortages of basic goods, and an inflation rate exceeding 80%. Conditions that compounded public disillusionment with parliamentary politics and weakened the credibility of civilian leaders, including Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel, whose minority government struggled to pass legislation or impose order as coalition arithmetic in the Grand National Assembly repeatedly collapsed. Within the military, senior officers increasingly viewed the situation as a threat, not only to internal stability, but to the secular foundations of the Republic and Turkey's reliability as a Western ally, assessments shaped by institutional memory of earlier interventions, and by intelligence reporting that framed domestic chaos as a vulnerability exploitable by external actors during a period of heightened East-West tension following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. The decision to intervene was not sudden, but the culmination of months of planning by the Armed Forces High Command, who concluded that the paralysis of civilian institutions had crossed a threshold beyond which incremental measures were insufficient. And in the early hours of September 12th, tanks rolled into major cities, communications were seized, political leaders were detained, and martial law was imposed nationwide in an operation notable for its speed, coordination, and lack of immediate resistance, reflecting both the exhaustion of the civilian population and the military's entrenched authority. Within hours, General Evren addressed the nation, announcing the suspension of democratic processes and the establishment of the National Security Council as the supreme governing body, framing the coup as a temporary corrective designed to restore order, protect national unity, and reset the political system rather than as a permanent seizure of power. A justification that echoed earlier interventions and was calibrated to domestic audiences, as well as to international partners attentive to continuity and predictability. Abroad, the reaction from Western capitals was cautious and restrained, as the United States and key European allies weighed their rhetorical commitment to democratic norms against the strategic necessity of stability in a country that controlled access to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus and hosted critical military installations integral to NATO's southern defense posture, installations whose uninterrupted operation was regarded as essential amid renewed superpower confrontation. While public statements expressed concern and called for a return to civilian rule, there was no serious effort to isolate or sanction the new military authorities, and diplomatic engagement continued largely uninterrupted, signaling an implicit prioritization of alliance cohesion and regional stability over immediate democratic restoration, a calculation informed by the memory of earlier coups in allied states and by the perception that Turkey's armed forces remained firmly anti-communist and aligned with Western strategic objectives. Inside Turkey, the military moved swiftly to dismantle the existing political landscape, banning political parties, arresting tens of thousands of activists across the ideological spectrum, and initiating a comprehensive campaign of repression that targeted trade unions, student organizations, and intellectual circles. Actions justified by the regime as necessary to eradicate extremism, but which also eliminated organized opposition and reshaped the balance of power in favor of a centralized, security-oriented state. The scope of the crackdown was extensive, with widespread reports of detention, censorship, and the use of military courts, measures that fundamentally altered civil society and left a legacy of trauma and depoliticization that would persist long after the generals withdrew from formal power. Concurrently, the junta embarked on an ambitious program of institutional redesign, commissioning a new constitution that strengthened executive authority, curtailed political freedoms, and institutionalized the military's role as guardian of the republic, embedding mechanisms that allowed the armed forces to intervene indirectly in civilian politics through bodies such as the National Security Council, even after a nominal return to democracy. Economically, the coup created the conditions for a radical policy shift, as the military-backed government endorsed market-oriented reforms under the stewardship of technocrats like Turgut Özal, whose stabilization program aimed to integrate Turkey more fully into global markets, curb inflation, and attract foreign capital, aligning economic restructuring with Western preferences, and reinforcing the perception among allies that the new order, while authoritarian, was reliable and pragmatic. This convergence of security and economic priorities further muted external criticism as Turkey's strategic value increased in the context of Middle Eastern instability and renewed Cold War confrontation, and as Western governments assessed that pressure on the junta could jeopardize access, cooperation, or influence. By 1982, the new constitution had been approved in a tightly controlled referendum, and General Evren was installed as president, formalizing the military's dominance while setting a timetable for a gradual, managed transition back to civilian rule. A transition designed to preserve the institutional prerogatives established by the coup and to prevent the re-emergence of the fragmented party politics that the generals blamed for the pre-1980 crisis. Internationally, Turkey's reintegration into the normal rhythms of alliance politics proceeded with little disruption, as joint exercises, intelligence cooperation, and defense planning continued, underscoring the extent to which NATO's stability had been insulated from Turkey's internal authoritarian turn. Even as human rights organizations documented abuses and the suppression of political life. The 1980 coup thus stands as a revealing episode in Cold War history, illustrating how the imperatives of alliance security and geopolitical positioning could override normative commitments to democratic governance, not through overt endorsement of authoritarianism, but through calibrated silence, limited criticism, and sustained engagement. Choices that reflected a broader pattern in which Western powers accepted illiberal outcomes in strategically vital states, so long as core security interests were preserved. As Turkey moved through the early 1980s under military tutelage, the immediate violence of the preceding decade subsided, but the cost was a reconfigured political order in which stability was achieved through control rather than consensus, a trade-off that would shape Turkish politics for decades, and exemplify the quiet compromises that defined the Cold War's peripheral theaters, where democracy was often secondary to the maintenance of a predictable alignment in an uncertain and polarized world. As the military regime consolidated its authority through the early 1980s, the Turkish coup of September 1980 increasingly revealed itself not as a brief corrective intervention, but as a structural re-engineering of the state carried out under the permissive shadow of Cold War geopolitics. And while the generals publicly reiterated their intention to restore civilian rule, their actions demonstrated a determination to redesign Turkey's political system in ways that would permanently constrain pluralism and insulate the state from the instability that had characterized the previous decade. The National Security Council, elevated to supreme authority, governed by decree, while martial law courts processed tens of thousands of detainees, and the scope of repression extended across ideological lines, ensnaring leftist militants, Kurdish activists, trade union leaders, and right-wing extremists alike, a breadth that allowed the regime to present itself as neutral and corrective rather than partisan, even as it dismantled the organizational infrastructure of political life. By 1981, all political parties had been formally dissolved, their assets seized, and their leadership barred from public office, effectively erasing the pre-coup political class and clearing the field for a controlled reconstruction of civilian politics under military supervision. This reconstruction was anchored by the drafting of a new constitution, a process tightly managed by the junta and insulated from meaningful public debate, which codified expansive powers for the executive, restricted freedom of association and expression, and entrenched the military's role as the ultimate arbiter of national security through constitutional guarantees, ensuring that even after elections resumed, civilian governments would operate within boundaries enforced by the armed forces. The referendum approving the Constitution in 1982, conducted under conditions of censorship and intimidation, provided a veneer of popular legitimacy while simultaneously elevating the coup leader to the presidency, symbolizing the fusion of military authority with formal state institutions. Economically, the period following the coup marked a decisive break with the import substitution policies of the post-war era, as the regime embraced liberalization, austerity, and export-oriented growth under a program designed to stabilize the economy and restore investor confidence. Reforms that were welcomed by international financial institutions and Western governments eager to see Turkey emerge as a stable, market-oriented partner on NATO's southern flank. This alignment of economic restructuring with strategic interests further dampened external criticism of the regime's human rights record, as the narrative of stabilization and reform overshadowed reports of torture, censorship, and political imprisonment, and as Western policymakers prioritized predictability and access over normative pressure. Within the Cold War context, the coup's timing was critical, occurring less than a year after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which heightened anxieties about regional instability and reinforced Turkey's value as a bulwark against perceived Soviet expansionism, particularly given its proximity to the Caucasus, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Intelligence cooperation and military coordination between Turkey and its allies intensified during this period, and the continuity of basing rights, radar installations, and logistical infrastructure reassured alliance planners that the coup had not disrupted Turkey's strategic orientation, even as it transformed its internal order. Domestically, however, the suppression of political life produced long-term consequences, including the depoliticization of society, the weakening of labor movements, and the narrowing of permissible discourse, effects that were justified by the regime as necessary to prevent a return to chaos, but which also entrenched a security-centric conception of governance that marginalized democratic participation. The Kurdish question, in particular, was subsumed under the regime's emphasis on unity and order, with cultural and political expression curtailed in ways that sowed the seeds for renewed conflict later in the decade, illustrating how the pursuit of stability through repression deferred rather than resolved underlying tensions. As the military prepared for a controlled transition back to civilian rule in the mid-1980s, it did so on its own terms, vetting parties and leaders, enforcing bans on former politicians, and shaping the electoral environment to ensure continuity rather than rupture. A process that underscored the extent to which the coup had recalibrated the balance between civilian authority and military guardianship. Internationally, this managed normalization was met with acceptance, if not approval, as Turkey resumed a semblance of democratic procedure without fundamentally altering its strategic posture, reinforcing the lesson that within the Cold War system, democratic deficits in key allied states were often tolerated so long as alignment and stability were maintained. The Turkish military coup of 1980 thus exemplifies the quiet trade-offs that defined Cold War alliance politics, where the preservation of order on a critical flank took precedence over democratic accountability, and where silence and engagement functioned as instruments of policy as consequential as condemnation or intervention, leaving behind a political architecture whose constraints would shape Turkey's trajectory long after the immediate crisis of the late 1970s had passed. By the mid-1980s, the long shadow of the 1980 coup had settled over Turkey's political landscape in ways that extended far beyond the formal end of direct military rule, as the institutions and norms imposed during the junta period continued to shape governance, constrain political competition, and define the boundaries of acceptable dissent, reflecting a deeper transformation in the relationship between the state, society, and the armed forces that had been quietly accepted by Turkey's Western partners in the name of stability. The transition to civilian government, initiated through tightly managed elections in 1983, did not represent a restoration of the pre-coup democratic order, but rather the inauguration of a new system in which civilian authority operated under the implicit veto of the military, with legal and constitutional mechanisms ensuring that any challenge to the security framework established after 1980 could be contained or reversed. This arrangement was evident in the continued prominence of the National Security Council, whose recommendations carried decisive weight and whose composition guaranteed military influence over policy areas extending well beyond defense, reinforcing a culture of deference among civilian leaders and embedding the coup's logic into everyday governance. For NATO and the United States, this outcome was broadly satisfactory, as Turkey remained a predictable and cooperative ally during a period of renewed Cold War tension, contributing to alliance planning, hosting critical infrastructure, and maintaining a posture aligned with Western strategic objectives, all while avoiding the kind of internal instability that might have invited external interference or weakened the alliance's southeastern flank. The muted response of Western governments to the enduring constraints on Turkish democracy underscored a broader pattern in Cold War politics, in which Allied authoritarianism was often reframed as disciplined governance when it served strategic ends, and where expressions of concern were carefully calibrated to avoid undermining cooperation, a pattern that contrasted sharply with the rhetoric deployed against adversarial regimes and highlighted the selective application of normative principles. Domestically, the social consequences of the coup-era repression became increasingly apparent as political engagement remained constrained. Civil society organizations operated under strict regulation, and the legacy of mass arrests and trials discouraged participation, fostering a climate in which stability was maintained at the cost of pluralism and public trust. The labor movement, once a significant force in Turkish politics, was particularly weakened, its organizational capacity dismantled, and its influence curtailed through legal restrictions that persisted into the post-coup era, aligning Turkey's economic restructuring with a depoliticized workforce more compatible with export-oriented growth and international investment. The judiciary, reshaped during the military period, functioned within a framework that prioritized state security over individual rights, reinforcing the coup's legacy through legal continuity rather than overt repression, and ensuring that challenges to the established order were filtered through institutions attuned to the priorities of stability and control. In the international arena, Turkey's experience was closely observed by other states navigating the tension between internal order and external alignment, particularly within regions where Cold War pressures intersected with domestic polarization, and the Turkish case offered a model, albeit an imperfect one, of how military intervention could be normalized and integrated into alliance politics without triggering isolation or sanctions. This normalization did not require explicit endorsement, but operated through a combination of silence, engagement, and the gradual resumption of routine cooperation, demonstrating how the absence of punitive measures could be as consequential as their imposition. As the Cold War neared its end, the structures established by the 1980 coup remained largely intact, even as global ideological confrontation receded, revealing the durability of arrangements forged under the pressure of superpower rivalry and the extent to which Cold War imperatives had reshaped domestic political orders in ways that outlived the conflict itself. In Turkey, debates over democracy, civil-military relations, and constitutional reform in the late 1980s and early 1990s unfolded within parameters set by the coup, illustrating how a moment of intervention justified by emergency could generate long-term constraints that proved resistant to change. From a historical perspective, the 1980 Turkish military coup stands not merely as a national turning point, but as a case study in Cold War alliance management, showing how the strategic value of a state could insulate it from external pressure, even as its internal political order was fundamentally altered, and how the prioritization of stability over democratic process was operationalized through quiet acceptance rather than overt support. This quiet acceptance, in turn, shaped the post-coup trajectory of Turkish politics, embedding a legacy of guarded democracy and military oversight that would remain a defining feature of the republic well into the post-Cold War era, and underscoring the extent to which Cold War geopolitics penetrated domestic governance, leaving behind institutional and normative imprints that endured long after the immediate strategic rationale had faded. As the Cold War entered its final phase, the long-term implications of the 1980 Turkish military coup became increasingly visible, revealing how an intervention justified as a temporary stabilization measure had reshaped the republic's political DNA in ways that neither the generals nor their Western partners fully reversed, even as global conditions changed. The managed return to civilian rule did not dismantle the security architecture imposed after 1980, but rather normalized it, embedding military oversight into constitutional practice and cultivating a political culture in which elected leaders internalized the limits of their authority, a condition reinforced by the continued exclusion of pre-coup political figures and the narrow ideological spectrum permitted within formal politics. This continuity ensured that the coup's logic outlived the Cold War moment that had helped legitimize it, as mechanisms designed to prevent polarization also constrained democratic renewal, producing a system characterized by procedural elections but substantive restrictions on participation and dissent. For Turkey's NATO partners, this outcome remained acceptable so long as the alliance's core interests were preserved, and as East-West confrontation diminished, there was no retroactive effort to challenge the compromises made in the name of stability during the early 1980s, illustrating how Cold War decisions acquired inertia and persisted even after their original strategic justification weakened. The absence of external pressure to revisit the post-coup settlement reinforced the authority of institutions shaped by the military period, allowing the security establishment to retain influence through legal means rather than overt intervention, and ensuring that the armed forces continued to function as a political reference point, even as they withdrew from day-to-day governance. Domestically, the social costs of this arrangement accumulated gradually as generations that had come of age under martial law and censorship inherited a depoliticized public sphere in which political engagement was cautious and fragmented, a legacy that complicated efforts to rebuild trust between state and society and to address unresolved questions of representation and identity. The Kurdish issue, suppressed rather than resolved during the coup era, re-emerged as a major challenge in the late 1980s, demonstrating how stability achieved through repression could defer conflict without eliminating its underlying drivers, and highlighting the limits of a security-first approach to governance. Internationally, Turkey's experience reinforced a broader Cold War lesson that the internal political evolution of strategically vital states was often subordinated to alliance imperatives, a lesson evident across multiple regions where military-backed regimes were tolerated or supported so long as they aligned with superpower interests. The Turkish case was distinctive not because of the severity of repression alone, but because of the ease with which the coup was absorbed into the routines of alliance politics, becoming a normalized feature rather than an anomaly requiring resolution. As historians reassessed the late Cold War period, the 1980 coup emerged as an example of how the pursuit of stability could generate long-term constraints that outlasted the conditions that produced them, shaping post-Cold War trajectories in ways that were neither accidental nor inevitable, but the result of deliberate choices made under geopolitical pressure. The coup thus stands as a reminder that Cold War stability was often achieved through quiet compromises that privileged predictability over participation, and that these compromises left institutional legacies that proved remarkably durable, influencing political outcomes well beyond the lifespans of the ideological conflict that had justified them. In this sense, the Turkish military intervention of 1980 was not merely a domestic rupture or a moment of authoritarian retrenchment, but a structural episode in the Cold War system itself, illustrating how alliance priorities could intersect with internal crises to produce political orders defined as much by what was prevented as by what was achieved, and leaving behind a framework of governance whose consequences continued to unfold as the Cold War receded into history. In its broader Cold War context, the 1980 Turkish military coup reveals how the logic of alliance management could normalize authoritarian intervention without formal endorsement, transforming what might otherwise have been treated as a democratic rupture into a manageable adjustment within an existing strategic framework. And by the late 1980s, this normalization had become so entrenched that the coup's origins were increasingly obscured by the routines of post-coup governance, as Turkey functioned outwardly as a stable parliamentary state, while inwardly retaining the constraints and hierarchies imposed during military rule. This duality was sustained by a tacit consensus among domestic elites and external partners that revisiting the foundations of the post-1980 order risked reopening the very instability the coup had been designed to suppress, a calculation that favored continuity over reform and reinforced the self-perpetuating character of the security-centered state. Within NATO, Turkey's experience was quietly instructive, demonstrating that alliance cohesion could be preserved even when a member state departed from democratic norms, provided that military interoperability, intelligence sharing, and strategic alignment remained intact. A lesson that reinforced the primacy of functional cooperation over political conditionality during the Cold War's final years. The absence of punitive consequences for the coup also underscored the asymmetry between rhetoric and practice in Western foreign policy, as commitments to democratic values were subordinated to geopolitical necessity through calibrated restraint rather than overt approval, a pattern that allowed policymakers to reconcile ideological dissonance without confronting it directly. Domestically, the persistence of coup-era institutions shaped political behavior long after the generals had retreated from the foreground, as parties and leaders adapted to an environment in which overt challenges to the security framework were discouraged, and incrementalism became the dominant mode of change, reinforcing a culture of caution that limited the scope of political imagination. The legal and constitutional architecture established in the early 1980s proved resilient, not because it commanded universal legitimacy, but because it was embedded in a broader equilibrium that balanced civilian governance with military guardianship, an equilibrium that was repeatedly validated by external acceptance and internal acquiescence. As the Cold War ended and Turkey confronted a shifting international environment, the legacy of the 1980 coup complicated efforts to redefine national identity and democratic practice, as reforms were pursued within constraints that reflected past compromises rather than present aspirations. In historical perspective, the coup illustrates how Cold War pressures could compress the range of political outcomes available to strategically important states, channeling them toward forms of governance deemed compatible with alliance stability, even at the expense of democratic depth. This compression was not imposed solely from outside, but emerged from an interaction between domestic fears of disorder and external incentives for predictability, producing a political order that appeared stable while carrying unresolved tensions beneath the surface. The Turkish military coup of 1980 thus stands as a testament to the quiet mechanisms through which Cold War priorities shaped domestic political trajectories, not through dramatic interventions by superpowers, but through the normalization of choices made under strategic pressure, choices whose consequences extended far beyond the moment of crisis and into the post-Cold War world, leaving behind a state whose stability was secured, but whose democratic evolution was indelibly shaped by the imperatives of an era defined by rivalry, alignment, and the management of risk. In its final assessment, the Turkish military coup of 1980 stands as a clear illustration of how Cold War geopolitics quietly reordered domestic political outcomes without the spectacle of superpower confrontation, demonstrating that stability on a strategically vital flank could be preserved through silence, accommodation, and selective engagement rather than overt endorsement or intervention. And as the Cold War concluded, the full weight of that accommodation became evident in the durability of the political architecture forged under military rule. The coup did not merely interrupt democratic governance, but recalibrated it, embedding security-first assumptions into constitutional law, political, culture, and institutional practice in ways that survived the general's withdrawal and shaped the behavior of subsequent civilian governments, ensuring that the boundaries imposed in 1980 continued to structure political life long after the immediate crisis had passed. For Turkey's Western allies, The episode confirmed that alliance reliability could be decoupled from democratic standards, and that authoritarian correction, when framed as temporary and technocratic, could be absorbed into the routines of NATO cooperation without triggering isolation or strategic rupture, a conclusion that reflected broader Cold War patterns in which predictability outweighed pluralism when the two came into conflict. This quiet prioritization of stability over democracy was not articulated as doctrine, but it operated effectively through the absence of punitive measures, the continuation of military and intelligence cooperation, and the normalization of post-coup governance as an acceptable variant within the alliance system. Domestically, the legacy of this arrangement manifested in a political order marked by caution, constrained participation, and an enduring imbalance between civilian authority and security institutions, conditions that limited the scope of democratic experimentation and reinforced the perception that certain outcomes lay beyond electoral reach. The repression of the early 1980s receded, but its institutional imprint remained, shaping legal frameworks, political incentives, and public expectations in ways that made the post-coup order resilient, even as social and economic conditions evolved. Historically, the 1980 coup reveals how Cold War imperatives could transform emergency measures into lasting structures, converting short-term interventions into long-term constraints through a combination of domestic acquiescence and external acceptance. It also underscores how the Cold War's influence extended beyond proxy wars and diplomatic crises into the internal governance of allied states, quietly determining which forms of political life were deemed compatible with strategic necessity. As such, the Turkish military coup should be understood not simply as a national episode of authoritarian intervention, but as a systemic event within the Cold War order, one that exposed the trade-offs embedded in alliance politics and the costs of privileging stability over democratic resilience. In the end, the coup achieved its immediate objectives of restoring order and preserving alignment. But it did so by reshaping Turkey's political trajectory in ways that would reverberate for decades, leaving behind a state whose strategic reliability was secured at the expense of democratic depth, and whose post-Cold War evolution remained inseparable from the quiet compromises made in September 1980 under the shadow of a divided world.